Hi, I'm Jeff Stark. This is the third video of a series of videos that we've titled Dismayed. Dismay number 1, Dismay number 2, and today is Dismayed number 3. We're going to step back a little bit, look at a broader understanding, scripturally speaking, of what dismay is, what influences us to get into this state of dismay, and certainly how God can help us to be delivered from it. And we're going to look at that more deeply today. 3 things I'd like to pass along to you, and I hope and I'm confident that these things will be helpful to you. If you are in a period of dismay, I think these videos will be helpful to you. If you know somebody who is in a state of dismay, these videos would hopefully be helpful to them as well. But if you're not currently, you might at some point find yourself in a state of dismay, which we're going to describe what that is in a couple of minutes. These videos, I'm confident, will be helpful to you. So let's get started. Number 1, what is dismay? Interestingly, the New Testament has nothing to say about dismay. You look up the word dismay in the New Testament, and I can't find it anywhere in the New Testament. Not surprisingly, though, the New Testament writers may not have felt that they needed to say a lot about it because the Old Testament does say a lot about dismay. It's in the book of Genesis, the book of Job, Chronicles talks about it. The psalmist talks about dismay from time to time, and certainly the prophets have a lot to say about the Israelites who find themselves occasionally in times of dismay. So, but what is dismay? Dismay is oftentimes in these chapters in the Old Testament. A couple of things. Number 1 is the authors are writing to people who are going through what we would call dire circumstances. They're in very, very difficult circumstances. They might be finding themselves in a state of life and death. Secondly, and oftentimes, the people who are in dismay are comparing themselves or describing the fact that the enemies are banging on the gates and banging on the doors. They're about to break the doors down. And when they break through the doors, they're going to come in and they're going to rape and pillage and plunder and maybe even put us to death or take us away in slavery, something as dire as that. And so there are these situations that the Israelites, for example, in the Old Testament, are finding themselves in a nearly doomed situation. And their reaction to it, secondly, is this thing that is described as dismay. So what specifically is this reaction that we would call an emotional reaction called dismay? Well, one way that you might want to describe it is just being extremely discouraged. But another way that I like to describe the emotion of dismay is discouragement on steroids. Discouragement times 10, for example. And the authors describe dismay as being deflated emotionally, that their emotional strength has been drained from them completely. It's certainly an emotional discouragement, very intense, but it's so intense that it causes the people who are going through it, oftentimes they will physically talk about being weak physically as well. They might find themselves being emotionally fainting or maybe even physically on the verge of fainting. So it's a very powerful emotion that affects one physically as well. And the third component that often comes with this dismay is oftentimes when the authors are talking about those who are in dismay, they're very, very afraid. The fear component is very, very high because they're in a situation that's impending doom, and they're lacking strength, they're weak, they're frail, and they're very afraid. That's what dismay is back in the Old Testament. You might have experienced something like this. I suspect if you're my age at 68 or younger, or certainly older, you probably can remember times when you've gone through this very emotional fainting sort of experience, emotional depletion of strength, and found yourself very afraid, very weak, and even emotionally, perhaps even physically, going about fainting. Thirdly, there's an answer to this. There's a antidote to this, And it's interesting that what the authors who describe themselves or the Israelites going through this dire experience, and then secondly reacting to it with such serious dismay. Well, the author almost invariably, almost always turns to those who are in dismay, tells those who are going through dismay to turn back to the Lord. It's very curious. He doesn't tell them to flee or run or get out the swords or remember your bank account or even turn to the Israelite community or the church community or call your pastor. What the author really encourages those who are going through these dire circumstances and they're feeling very emotionally and physically depleted. He tells them to turn back to the Lord. Let me give you an example of this. This is just one example of many examples in the Old Testament that are very similar to this. The psalmist, whom we know as David in this case, in Psalm 143, listen to what he says in verse 3 and 4. Verse 3, the enemy pursues me. He crushes me to the ground. He makes me dwell in darkness like those long dead. So my spirit, there's the external circumstances. The enemy is pursuing me. He's crushing me. He's banging at the gates and he's chasing me down. And verse 4 says this, so my spirit grows faint within me, and my heart within me is dismayed. So there's the internal part of the enemy's doom is imminent, but inwardly and in my heart and in my spirit, I'm feeling dismayed, I'm feeling weak, I'm growing faint. Now, listen to verse 5. That's verse 3 and 4. Now listen to verse 5. I remember the days of long ago. I meditate on all your works, meaning God's works, and consider, think hard and long and hard, I consider what your hands have done. I spread out my hands to you. My soul thirsts for you like a parched land. Answer me quickly, O Lord. My spirit fails. Do not hide your face from me. So here's the external. The enemy is upon me. I'm growing faint and weak inside and outside. But I'm turning to the Lord. I'm going to remember the Lord and his goodness, his kindness, his mercy, his deliverance in times past. And as I remember and think accurately about life and about you and about how big and how powerful and wonderful you have been in the past, then as I draw near to the Lord in that way, and as he draws near to me, reminds me of the truth is how big and powerful and wonderful and intimate he is and how he wants to rescue his people. As I turn back to the Lord in that way, he renews my strength. He lifts me up. He encourages me. He replaces discouragement with encouragement. He replaces dismay with hope. And that's where the psalmist and the prophet encourages us to turn when we feel dismayed. That's the antidote that he's laying out for us. And when we turn back to the Lord like that, what happens to us is very, very helpful. Chapter 40 of Isaiah is talking to people who are dismayed. But listen, these are passages that are very familiar to us, and listen once again to them. Why do you say, O Jacob, and complain, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, my cause disregarded by my God? Do you not know, have you not heard? The Lord is an everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired and weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord, those who turn to the Lord, who is described in chapter 40 as very, very big, very, very intimate, very, very personal in wanting to rescue those who believe in him. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. Those who draw near to the God in truth, God will draw near to them and renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary, and they will walk and not faint. So again, dire circumstances, The author is telling us to turn back and remind ourselves of this great, big, wonderful, personal, loving God who in past times past has rescued us, who is very, very capable of rescuing us once again as we draw near to him in truth and as he brings those truths home to us and as we believe those great and wonderful biblical truths. God promises that when he comes, according to truth, he will also give strength to us and encouragement to us so that we can persevere and endure even in the trial. You know, it's a very common theme in all of scriptures. Let me just pause for a moment to tell you and to remind you of this as well. That trials, God's people who have gone through trials for thousands of years, trials really serve one purpose. We are in the New Testament right now, and if you're a Christian, then you're familiar with going through difficult hardships and sufferings and trials. But the author tells us, what the authors of the scriptures tell us, what's the purpose of trial? If you're going through trial right now as a Christian, it serves basically one purpose from God's point of view. This trial that you're going through, maybe experiencing discouragement and maybe dismay, this trial is serving one purpose, and that is to get you to draw near to God in your heart. Did you know that? Every trial it serves one purpose primarily, and that is to get you to draw near to God according to truth. And when we do that, God will draw near to us, and he will strengthen us and encourage us and give us endurance and give us patience and perseverance and love and kindness and patience. This is very, very important. We're seeing that this is taking place in the Old Testament as the Old Testament saints find themselves in a very difficult trial. They're feeling dismay. They're feeling weak, discouraged. The author is telling them to turn back to God in truth, draw near to him in truth, and as God draws near to them, he will increase their strength. He will increase their hope, and what comes with God and his strength is also the endurance and perseverance that we're so badly needing in trials. By the way, this is all much more fully described in other videos that we have titled Trials. Trials number 1, Trials number 2, Trials number 3, Trials number 4. It's important that we as Christians, New Testament Christians, understand that we go through trials, but the purpose of trials, as in the Old Testament, is to get us to draw near to him, and when we do, he comes and gives strength to the weary. So you might want to review those videos called Trials, also on my YouTube channel. Those will prove to be very helpful and encouraging to you if you find yourself going through a trial, or if you know of another Christian who is going through trials, but they may be discouraged, they may be afraid, they may be dismayed. You might want to point them to these videos titled Dismayed, or the other videos titled Trials. Okay, so number 3 in our dismay here, the third thing that I wanted to point out to you in this particular video is going back to what I described in video number 1, and that is there was a point in time when my wife and I went through a marital spat. It affected me terribly. It was terribly discouraging to me, surprisingly discouraged. I felt like I had been a balloon, popped that balloon, and now I was deflated. I was discouraged. I was weak. I was faint, and I was lacking strength. You'll see this in video 1 described at length, that I stumbled into my sunroom. I opened up the Bible, and I just happened to turn to chapter 41 of Isaiah. And very similarly, Isaiah was describing for me the fact that I was dismayed. Remember, I read this in verse 10 of Isaiah chapter 41. So do not fear, for I am with you. There's that fear component. Do not be dismayed, for I am with you. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. There's all those components. Circumstances, my marriage felt like it had just fallen through a trap door with me. I felt dismayed, terribly discouraged. There was fear connected to it, and I had turned out to be very, very weak. And so I was certainly relating to that experience of extreme discouragement and dismay. But God was telling me the antidote to that was, like we saw earlier in Psalm 143, turn back to me. Turn to me. Remember me. Remember how big I am. Remember how wonderful I am. Remember days past of how I delivered you and I helped you and I rescued you. He says, so do not fear, for I am with you. Who's you? I am with you. Who am I? I'm sorry. Who am I? I am the God who is described in chapter 40, who holds the waters of the earth in the palm of his hand, who has the stars all in place. He has a name for every one of them. Not one of them is missing. This is very helpful to me back then. And it goes on to say, I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you by my righteous right hand. So, what I learned in that experience, a little bit more specifically here in this video, was this. I came to understand that I had given, inadvertently and unknowingly to me, I had given my marriage far too much power and too much influence in my life, and I really didn't know that. I had always tried to make God the most powerful and the most influential thing in my life. But unbeknownst to me, I had drifted away from giving God the power and the influence in my life. It had drifted over, too much so, to the place of my marriage and to my wife. And so when my wife and I got into this particular spat, I felt like the trap door had opened up and I'd fallen through, and I'd grown very faint and very weary, and was in a terribly, very, very quickly in a season of discouragement and dismay. I felt like a trap door had opened up and I had fallen through. Here's another way of describing. I felt like my house that morning was on a rock rather. But when the wind came and the trials came, and my house collapsed, my house being me, I came to understand eventually that my house really was on sand and not on the rock. But as I turned back to God, who is the rock, and I remembered him, how powerful and how wonderful he is, I began now to draw back to God and build my house back on the rock. Well, then he did draw near to me as I was doing that. He gave me strength. He gave me encouragement. My discouragement, my fear, and my dismay went down as God and his promises drew near to me in truth. And an hour and a half later, when I got back off that sofa, I felt I was a very, very different person. And you know what? Here's the curious thing. My marriage didn't change. My marriage hadn't changed in that hour and a half. But what had changed was my heart. And that was God was trying to get to. He understood that I had given too much influence and power away from him to my marriage. And when I fell through that trap door and realized that, and I turned back to him, he drew near to my heart. He gave me strength. He gave me hope. He gave me encouragement. He answered my prayers. And when I got up off that couch an hour and a half later, my influence and my power had returned to God and the gospel. And indeed, he had renewed my strength, for which I was very, very helpful. As I said in video one, my wife and I had a great day. And I'm not even sure she understood what had happened, but that's a very powerful thing that had happened to me, and a lot had been learned. And what I'm passing along to you right now was this idea that I had inadvertently and unknowingly to me, I had transferred my power and influence of my heart over to my marriage away from God. And I didn't even know it until my marriage ran into a problem, and then I felt like I went through a trap door. But God was good, and God was gracious to me. And as I followed the commandments here about drawing near to the Lord in my dismay, God drew near to me, and he lifted me up, and he gave me strength, for which I'm very, very happy. You may be going through a season of dismay right now, and if so, possibly what happens to you is you had put something. Here's an example. Maybe your retirement fund has vanished, and hundreds of thousands of dollars have vaporized, and you feel like you've just gone through a trap door. Or 10 or 20 other kinds of situations that can act like trap doors. Well, if you passed your power, the power and influence of your life over from God to your 401k, or your mother and father, or your wife, or your husband, or your children, or whatever it might, or maybe it was your health, and the doctor called and said, now you have cancer, and you feel like you've gone through a trap door. Well, There's all kinds of circumstances and situations where we can put our hope, our strength, and the amount of influence that's in our life. And when that trap door opens up, we collapse. Well, it's not the end of the world. And God may be very well using that in your life in the same way that he used it in my life, and that is to bring me back to him and find that he can renew our strength even in the most dire of circumstances. I hope that's helpful. Hopefully that's helpful to you if you're in a dire situation experiencing dismay and discouragement and fear, or you may know one or two other people who are experiencing something like that as well, circumstantially reacting to it with dismay and discouragement and fear, who need instructions on how to turn back to the Lord at that point in time, this point in time, and give them help. This is video number 3. You might want to look at video number 1 and 2 called Dismay. You might also want to go back to the other videos I made reference to, which are called Trials number 1, Trials number 2, Trials number 3. I hope that's helpful.